You will not be able to stay home, brother. You will not be able to plug in, turn on, and cop out. You will not be able to lose yourself on Skag and skip out for beer during commercials because the revolution will not be televised. The revolution will not be televised. The revolution will not be brought to you by Xerox in 4 parts without commercial interruptions. The revolution will not show you pictures of Nixon blowing a bugle and leading a charge by John Mitchell, General Abrams, and Spyro Agnew to eat hog maws confiscated from a Harlem sanctuary. The revolution will not be televised. The revolution will not be brought to you by the Schaefer Award Theater and will not star Natalie Woods and Steve McQueen or Bullwinkle and Julia. The revolution will not give your mouth sex appeal. The revolution will not get rid of the nubs. The revolution will not make you look 5 pounds thinner because the revolution will not be televised, brother. There will be no pictures of you and Willie Mae pushing that shopping cart down the block on the dead run or trying to slide that color TV into a stolen ambulance. NBC will not be able to predict the winner at 8:32 on report from 29 districts. The revolution will not be televised. There will be no pictures of pigs shooting down brothers on the instant replay. There will be no pictures of pigs shooting down brothers on the instant replay. There will be no pictures of Whitney Young being run out of Harlem on a rail with a brand new process. There will be no slow motion or still lights of Roy Wilkins strolling through Watts in a red, black, and green liberation jumpsuit that he has been saving for just the proper occasion. Green Acres, Beverly Hillbillies, and Hooterville Junction will no longer be so damn relevant, and women will not care if Dick finally got down with Jane on Search for Tomorrow, because black people will be in the street looking for a brighter day. The revolution will not be televised. There will be no highlights on the 11 o'clock news and no pictures of Harry armed women liberationists and Jackie Onassis blowing her nose. The theme song will not be written by Jim Webb or Francis Scott Keys, nor sung by Glenn Campbell, Tom Jones, Johnny Cash, Engelbert Humperdinck, or The Rare Earth. The revolution will not be televised. The revolution will not be right back after a message about a white tornado, white lightning, or white people. You will not have to worry about a dove in your bedroom, the tiger in your tank, or the giant in your toilet bowl. The revolution will not go better with Coke. The revolution will not fight germs that may cause bad breath. The revolution will put you in the driver's seat. The revolution will not be televised, will not be televised, will not be televised, will not be televised. The revolution will be no rerun, brothers. The revolution will be live.
Simply put, the reason why these systems of government have never worked, you surrender your freedom for free stuff. Where does the government get the money to provide all this free stuff? They must tax the rich and or tax the middle class. This drives the rich out of the state, as seen in New York, Chicago, and California. Socialists believe that the wealth of a few can be redistributed to the many, and that the state can better manage resources more fairly than chaotic markets. Nobody needs to go hungry, homeless, or without health care if the right people are in charge. These are the lofty promises these socialist politicians make. The state owns everything, produces everything, and provides everything. Therefore, the supply and demand factor has been taken out of the equation.
It always starts with a promise, a beautiful, seductive, irresistible promise that the wealth of the few can be redistributed to the many, that the state can manage resources more fairly than chaotic markets, that nobody needs to go hungry, homeless, or without health care if only the right people are in charge. It's a promise that has inspired revolutions, toppled governments, and captured the imagination of brilliant minds across centuries. Karl Marx, Vladimir Lenin, Fidel Castro, Hugo Chavez, all of them believed with genuine conviction that they had discovered the formula for a just society. All of them promised prosperity, equality, and liberation from exploitation, and every single one of them, without exception, produced poverty, oppression, and economic collapse. Not because they were uniquely evil, not because their followers were uniquely stupid, but because the system they built violates laws more fundamental than any political ideology, the laws of economics. And economics, unlike politics, doesn't care about your intentions. It only responds to incentives. To understand why socialist economies always fail, you first need to understand why they always sound so convincing. Because the appeal of socialism isn't irrational, it's deeply human. Look around any capitalist society and you'll see genuine injustice. Billionaires who inherited their wealth, workers who labor their entire lives and retire with nothing, healthcare systems that bankrupt families, housing markets that price out entire generations. These are real problems, and socialism offers a real-sounding solution. Take the excess from those who have too much. Give it to those who have too little. Use the power of the state to ensure that basic needs are met for everyone. Who could argue with that? The answer, it turns out, is reality itself. Because the problem with socialism isn't its goals. The goals are often admirable. The problem is its mechanism, the way it tries to achieve those goals. And that mechanism contains a fatal flaw so fundamental, so mathematical, so immune to political will, that it has destroyed every economy that has tried to ignore it. That flaw has a name, the calculation problem. And understanding it is the key to understanding why socialism's 100% failure rate is not a coincidence. The calculation problem, why central planning always fails. In 1920, the Austrian economist Ludwig von Mises published an essay that changed the history of economic thought, and he asked a simple question. How does a socialist economy decide what to produce? In a market economy, the answer is prices. Prices carry information. When the price of something rises, it signals that demand is high or supply is low. Producers respond by making more. When prices fall, it signals oversupply. Producers respond by making less. Millions of individual decisions, made by millions of individual people pursuing their own interests, are constantly coordinating through the price system to allocate resources efficiently. Nobody plans it. Nobody controls it. It emerges spontaneously from the interaction of buyers and sellers. Mises pointed out that a socialist economy eliminates this mechanism. When the state owns all the means of production, when there are no private buyers and sellers negotiating prices, the price signals disappear. And without price signals, there's no way to calculate whether resources are being used efficiently. No way to know whether it makes more sense to build a hospital or a factory, whether to plant wheat or corn, whether to invest in steel or aluminum. Without prices, economic calculation becomes impossible. The state is flying blind. And when you fly blind with an entire economy, you crash. Friedrich Hayek, Mises's intellectual partner, an eventual Nobel Prize winner, extended this argument further. He pointed out that the information needed to run an economy efficiently is not just complex, it is dispersed. It exists in millions of individual minds, in local knowledge that no central authority can ever fully access or process. The farmer knows his soil, the merchant knows his customers, the engineer knows his tools. This knowledge cannot be collected, centralized, and processed by any government bureaucracy, no matter how large or sophisticated. The market, through prices, aggregates this dispersed knowledge automatically. Socialism destroys that aggregation mechanism and replaces it with bureaucratic guessing. And bureaucratic guessing, no matter how well-intentioned, always produces the same result. Shortages of things people need, surpluses of things nobody wants, and an economy that produces less and less value with more and more effort. This isn't ideology, it's information theory, and every socialist economy in history has proven it correct. The Soviet Union, the largest economic experiment in history, the Soviet Union was the most ambitious attempt to build a socialist economy the world has ever seen. For over 70 years, the Soviet state controlled every factory, every farm, every mine, every shop. Central planners in Moscow decided what to produce, how much to produce, and how to distribute it across 11 time zones and 300 million people. At its peak, the Soviet planning apparatus employed hundreds of thousands of bureaucrats attempting to manage an economy of staggering complexity. They produced 5-year plans of breathtaking detail. They built massive industrial complexes. They launched the first satellite into space. They educated an entire population. And for a while, the numbers looked impressive. Soviet GDP grew rapidly through the 1950s and 1960s. Western observers worried that the USSR might actually overtake the capitalist world economically. But beneath the impressive statistics, the calculation problem was doing its silent, inevitable work. Soviet factories produced what the plan told them to produce, not what people actually needed. The famous Soviet nail story illustrates the absurdity perfectly. When planners set production targets in terms of numbers of nails, factories produced millions of tiny, useless nails. When targets switched to weight, factories produced a few enormous nails that nobody could use. Either way, the hardware stores were empty of the nails people actually needed. Multiply this dysfunction across every industry in the economy, from food to housing to clothing to medicine, and you begin to understand why Soviet citizens spent their lives standing in lines for basic goods that market economies took for granted. By the 1970s, the Soviet economy was stagnating. Growth slowed, productivity declined, innovation essentially stopped. Because innovation requires risk-taking. Risk-taking requires incentives, and incentives require the possibility of personal reward. In a socialist economy where the state owns everything and personal profit is eliminated, the incentive to innovate disappears. Why work harder when the reward is the same regardless of your effort? Why take risks when failure means punishment, but success means nothing? The Soviet engineer who invented a more efficient production method received the same salary as the one who invented nothing. The farmer who grew more crops saw his surplus confiscated by the state. The factory manager who cut costs and improved quality faced no competition because there was no competition. The entire economy became a monument to mediocrity, because mediocrity was the rational response to a system that destroyed the incentive to excel. By 1991, the Soviet economy had collapsed so completely that the state could no longer feed its own people. The USSR dissolved not because it was defeated militarily, not because of American aggression, but because an economic system that violated the laws of incentives and calculation finally exhausted itself. 70 years, 300 million people, immeasurable human suffering. And the conclusion was the same one Mises had reached in 1920. Without prices, without private property, without incentives, an economy cannot function. Venezuela. How to destroy the world's largest oil reserves in 20 years. If the Soviet Union's collapse was slow and grinding, Venezuela's was spectacular and swift, and it is perhaps the most instructive socialist failure of the modern era, because Venezuela didn't start poor. In the 1970s, Venezuela was one of the wealthiest countries in Latin America. It sat on the world's largest proven oil reserves. Its cities were modern, its middle class was growing, its future seemed bright. Then came Hugo Chavez. Elected in 1999 on a platform of socialist revolution, Chavez nationalized industries, seized private farms, imposed price controls, and used oil revenues to fund massive social programs. In the short term, it looked like it was working. Oil prices were high, money flowed, poverty rates fell. Chavez was celebrated internationally as proof that socialism could deliver prosperity. But beneath the oil-funded boom, the calculation problem was running its inevitable course. Price controls made it unprofitable to produce basic goods. Farmers stopped farming because the state set food prices below the cost of production. Businesses closed because the state set selling prices below the cost of manufacturing. Shortages appeared, first of luxury goods, then of basic staples, then of medicine, then of everything. When oil prices collapsed in 2014, the illusion ended. Venezuela's economy, hollowed out by 2 decades of socialist mismanagement, had no foundation left. Inflation exploded. By 2018, it had reached over $1,000%, 1 million percent. A cup of coffee that cost 2 bolivars in 2012 cost 2 million bolivars by 2019. Families carried cash in wheelbarrows to buy bread. Doctors and engineers fled to Colombia, Peru, and Chile. Hospitals ran out of basic medicines. Children died from diseases that had been eradicated decades earlier. An entire generation was sacrificed on the altar of an ideology that promised them everything and delivered nothing. Today, over 7 million Venezuelans have fled their country. The largest refugee crisis in Latin American history, caused not by war, not by natural disaster, but by socialism. Cuba, the longest-running economic prison. Cuba offers a different kind of lesson, because Cuba didn't collapse dramatically like Venezuela. It simply stopped, frozen in time. An economy preserved like an insect in amber, a monument to what happens when a socialist system is maintained by force long after its failures are undeniable. When Fidel Castro took power in 1959, Cuba was one of the more prosperous countries in the Caribbean. By the 1980s, it was dependent on Soviet subsidies to survive. When the Soviet Union collapsed and those subsidies disappeared, Cuba entered what Castro called the special period, a euphemism for a humanitarian catastrophe. Food rations dropped to starvation levels. Electricity was available only a few hours a day. Cubans lost an average of 20 pounds of body weight. The economy shrank by 35% in 3 years. And yet, instead of reforming, the Castro regime doubled down, tightening controls, imprisoning dissidents, blaming America. Today, 65 years after the revolution, Cuba remains one of the poorest countries in the Western Hemisphere. Its doctors are world-class, but its hospitals have no medicine. Its education system is excellent, but its graduates have nowhere to work. Its people are resourceful and talented, but trapped in an economic system that punishes productivity and rewards compliance. The average Cuban state salary is the equivalent of around $20 per month. $20 in a country where basic goods cost the same as they do in Miami. The calculation problem doesn't care how passionate the revolution was. It doesn't care how sincere the ideology is. It produces the same result every time. Poverty, shortages, stagnation. China's confession. Perhaps the most powerful evidence that socialism doesn't work came not from its critics, but from its most important practitioner. In 1978, after the catastrophic failures of Mao Zedong's socialist policies had killed tens of millions in famines and economic collapse, China's new leader, Deng Xiaoping, made a decision that implicitly admitted everything the critics had been saying. He introduced market reforms. He allowed private property. He permitted entrepreneurs to keep profits. He invited foreign investment. He reintroduced prices. In other words, he abandoned socialism, not officially, not rhetorically. China still calls itself a socialist state. But economically, the reforms Deng introduced were a direct repudiation of socialist calculation. And the results were immediate and dramatic. China's economy grew at nearly 10% per year for 3 decades. Hundreds of millions were lifted out of poverty. The fastest and largest reduction in human poverty in history, achieved not by more socialism, but by less, by reintroducing the market mechanisms that socialism had destroyed. China's story is often cited by socialist defenders as proof that socialism can work. It is actually proof of the opposite. China's success began the moment it moved away from socialist planning toward market economics. The lesson is unmistakable. Markets work. Planning doesn't. Even the Chinese Communist Party, after enough suffering, was forced to admit it. North Korea versus South Korea, the perfect natural experiment. If you want the clearest possible proof that socialism destroys economies, look at the Korean peninsula. In 1945, Korea was divided into 2 halves, North and South. Same people, same culture, same language, same history, same starting point. One half adopted capitalism, the other adopted socialism. 70 years later, South Korea is one of the wealthiest, most technologically advanced nations on Earth. Home to Samsung, Hyundai, LG, and a standard of living comparable to Western Europe. North Korea is one of the poorest, most isolated, most oppressive nations on Earth. Its people are shorter than South Koreans because of chronic malnutrition. Its economy is smaller than the city of Columbus, Ohio. Its citizens are imprisoned in a system that punishes independent thought and rewards absolute submission. Same people, same starting point, different economic systems, different outcomes. The contrast is so stark, so complete, so undeniable that it functions as a controlled experiment in economic systems. And the result of that experiment has been clear for decades. Capitalism creates wealth, socialism destroys it.
The evidence is totally overwhelming. So, the simple question is, how did these democratic socialist candidates miss this history? They don't know this history because they're too young. They have no frame of reference from which to assess the socialist communist government mode. Democratic socialism will ultimately morph into communism.